This is the Impunity Observer podcast. Fergus Hodgson, your host. I'm always privileged to do these shows, and I'm honored to have a rising star, or he's a star now, star journalist, Orlando Avendaño today. He is the senior editor at Voz US, and on X it is at VOZ_US. And his own X handle, that's the place to follow him, is ORLVNDOA. So Orlando Avendaño is the way to go now. I've got him on because I really want to see, a bit more clarity or provide more clarity regarding what can and or will happen with U.S. engagement with Venezuela. He now is based in Colombia, Venezuelan exile. And so I guess my first question for you, Orlando, and I'm really pleased to speak with you, mate. Thanks for your time. Is there a peaceful way out of this dictatorship or quagmire? Can there be a negotiated departure of the regime's rulers at this moment?
Yeah. First of all, thank you very much, Fergus. It's an honor to be here with you. It could have been a peaceful way, but unfortunately, Nicolas Maduro has decided that it's not. It's going to be his way, the way his regime is going to end. Last year, there were elections in Venezuela, which the opposition won in a landslide, 70 to 30%. It was big, huge. The opposition managed to prove its victory in the election with the actas and all this, the Tarish, all of this. But Maduro decided to stall that election and just keep going with the repression, killing the protesters.
Let's back up a little bit here because maybe you misunderstood my question. If there's sufficient pressure uh, or if there are enough threats placed upon the regime, could they not be persuaded to go and live in Cuba and just escape and live in peace?
Well, not only threats, what we're seeing right now in the Caribbean is pressure as we've never seen before. You have all these, the USS Iwo Jima, all these ships and all of that. I think that the threats are real and tough. Today, the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, said to his troops in the USS Iwo Jima in Puerto Rico, this is not training, this is real. So I think that the United States is willing to, resolve this, to really attack the roots of the problem, which is narco trafficking and drug killing Americans. And Nicolas Maduro understands that. I think they they're going to try to resist. They're going to try to maybe root that the United States will never cross the red line, will never, make that step. But I think that this time the U.S. is really willing to do it, and maybe Nicolas Maduro think that is not going to happen. They may be thinking that this could be bluff, but at the same time they are really preparing to resist. They don't have how to because there are no troops or people in the U.S. who could resist an attack from the U.S. But yeah, there needs to be pressure, and eventually, if they do not cave, uh, the U.S. has to achieve the goal of striking the Venezuela and striking the cartels and the narco traffickers in Venezuela.
Welcome to the Impunity Observer, your trusted source for in-depth analysis and investigative reports on Latin America. We uncover the stories behind the headlines, focusing on economic development, the rule of law, and international trade. Stay informed with expert insights and fearless journalism. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to never miss our latest content. Well, the next step presumably would be actually striking targets within Venezuelan territory. And are you optimistic, or do you foresee that actually happening?
There are a lot of people that are saying that this could be chaotic if this happens, and we have to avoid an intervention, as there used to be interventions. You can quote the example of what happened in the Middle East, Afghanistan, Iraq. We don't want that. We don't want the U.S. involving or intervening, a country which could develop in chaos. But this is not going to happen in Venezuela. The regime has never faced a deadly threat that it is facing right now. So the military won't be resistant. You won't have like the military, the Venezuelans fighting against the US, trying to defend the cartel, trying to defend Diosdado Cabello or Nicolas Maduro. You won't have that. So the moment there is a strike inside Venezuela, I believe that the regime will collapse. However, I think that this is bigger than Nicolas Maduro, as we know. This is not only one person. This is not about just eliminating the dictator or decapitating the regime. This is bigger. You have many factions within the regime. So I do believe that is the U.S. At the end, it has to strike inside Venezuela. It has to do some strikes, not just one. Eventually it will lead to a transition, because there's one thing that is very important, Fergus. There is this idea of regime change which scare not only the Americans but everybody. We don't want no regime change. The US cannot provoke a regime change. This is not about regime change. I mean, the decision to change the regime already happened, and there's a structure which has legitimacy. People voted for it in a landslide, and you have a president elect, Maria Corina Machado, which is the legitimate leader inside Venezuela, which has more than 80% of support. You have all that structure, but on the other hand, the Nicolas Maduro government is not a dictatorship as a traditional, regular, classical dictatorship of the last century in Latin America. No, this is a cartel. This is an organized crime cartel that is kidnapping Venezuela. So it's not about regime change. It's about eradicating a cartel that is targeting the US, that is targeting Americans. And not only Americans, but the whole region, not only with narco trafficking, with drugs, but this is destabilizing the region, financing far left groups that are creating chaos in the region. And I think that that is not in the interest of this administration.
Yeah, that's obviously an important part of how you brand any engagement. That this is not a government that represents the people of Venezuela. It's an imposter organization, and also it is funded by and supported heavily by foreign regimes, right? The Cubans most notably, but almost everyone is there, it seems. So it's almost restoring sovereignty rather than violating it. It's a bit confusing for people. Yeah. So let me try to summarize what you've told me here. You are not optimistic that without actual direct confrontation, there will be any backward step from the Chavistas in power right now.
Well, my bet, my personal bet, is that confrontation will not be needed, because, as I uh, was telling you, nobody will defend this regime. Nobody will give their lives to defend this regime. However, there are factions within the regime uh, whose life, for example, Diosdado Cabello, whose life depends on retaining power. He is involved the cartels of the 80s in Colombia. Once you enter in a cartel in narco trafficking, you cannot leave. At least not in a safe way. So, this guy and his group, his people, has killed so many people, has tortured so many people, has been involved in so many criminal things, that, the idea of he just leaving the country, going to the exile with his family, that will not guarantee him or his family that they will be okay, because they have been involved in crime, serious crime. They have hurt so many people. So he understands that his only option, the only thing he can do is resist, and the only way he can leave Venezuela is to a prison or in a coffin, as one senior administration advisor told Axios a few days ago. In a horse bag. So yeah, that open the scenario where there are factions that may drag the regime to this scenario of confrontation. That they will resist. They will, maybe not the whole regime, but some factions will, and that is, I think, the biggest threat right now in Venezuela.
Yeah, I mean, it can be a bit confusing for people to understand because, on the one hand, as you said, the conventional armed forces are neither going to be, let's say, equipped or capable of defending Venezuela or motivated to do so. But there are people who are deep in the regime who, as you say, they're backed into a corner. It's very hard for them to do anything else. But you also are asserting that, yes, there might not be a full out military conflict, but some escalated intimidation or attack that would be almost nominal, but enough to scare the conventional armed forces to abandon their posts, if I can put it that way.
The regime has never faced an existential threat.
What about the drug cartels? Because you might say that the Colombians, for example, are much more hardened. They've been fighting the FARC for 60 years, right? Haven't the Venezuelans faced such challenges?
Yeah, well, there's one thing that, of course, is very serious. There are approximately 6,000 cartel members of the Colombian guerrillas in Venezuela. Venezuela is a safe haven for these cartels. They left Colombia and are based right now in Venezuela. That is an important threat. I trust Maria Corina Machado. Maria Corina Machado has been saying recently that she understands it perfectly. Her team understands this perfectly. They assure that they have the plan to retain the territorial control, to keep the stability in government, and they understand that. I think the United States also understands that. In this um, war against the cartels, you have to have that as an objective. Not only is the cartel of the Suns, Cartel de los Soles in Venezuela, led by Nicolas Maduro, the head of the cartel is Maduro and Diosdado and all of this. But you also have all these guerrillas, criminal groups that are not precisely, in the main cities of Venezuela, but in the border region with Colombia, the border with Colombia, and that's a menace you have to address eventually. But I do think that you can manage to have control of the country, of the biggest city of the country, before addressing that threat, which eventually I think a government of, whether it be a government of Maria Corina Machado or Edmundo Gonzalez, will have to address, of course, with the support of the allies in the region, not only the US but many allies.
You would hope so. Yeah. So, mate, there's so much you want to unpack there, and that's what you're pointing to. One of the challenges that it's not just a case of cutting off their head. There are so many different groups, and even groups that don't necessarily like each other in this awkward coalition, and that's why I think it could get very messy. Now, back in 2018, the years fly by. The Center for Security Policy, one of the top national defense think tanks in Washington, D.C., put out a position statement or decision brief saying the United States should arm Venezuelans to take their country back. At this time, of course, Petro was not president of Colombia, nor was Lula president of Brazil. But the idea was that the U.S. would basically train a military force of Venezuelan exiles. Is this even a possibility? Could this be done?
I think that you will need much more than that. What you're facing in Venezuela is serious. Not only the regime, but all of these cartels. Yeah, I think you will need much more than that. Once you can retake the country, I mean, the main cities. Once you can start a transition, I think that is something that could happen. One example for me will be, what President Uribe did in Colombia against the guerrilla. with the support of in financial terms, but also in logistical and training terms, with the support of the U.S., Uribe managed to almost eliminate the threat that has been creating chaos in Colombia for the last 40, 50 years. So yeah, I think you can manage to do something like that, but first of all, you have to start the transition, return the power in the main cities. Of course, see which what you can count on. What men's you will have on the ground, whether military that will be supporting the new government, uh, policemen. What structure will you have so you can start working towards that objective. But yeah, I think that you will eventually need some support from the allies in the region.
Well, the thing is, the reason why they took this decision, this think tank or promoted this, is just that they know that it's not popular among regular Americans to go to war with even if people think that they hate the socialists, they're just going, we don't have the energy for this, the bandwidth. But so the idea would be also, if we have Venezuelans doing it, it's not like we're the imperialistas, but at the end of the day, really, it's the Americans who have to run the show anyway. So it's almost like, what's the point? You might as well just do it yourselves. Do you follow me?
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, I understand that this is a sensitive discussion in the U.S. But yeah, I mean, Venezuelans have to do this. Venezuelans have to lead this. Venezuelans have to retake the freedom of our country. Venezuelans ultimately, actually, that's what Deputy Secretary Landau said a few weeks ago, that the U.S. could help, could pressure as much as it can, but ultimately it has to be the Venezuelans who retake their freedom. And ultimately, it has to be the Venezuelans who fight against the enemies and these criminals inside the country. But, at the same time, I think that this administration, we just saw what Politico published of this change of focus that will have the Department of War now, which is going to focus on the region, on the hemisphere, not on what's happening, in the Middle East or the far East Europe. I think that this administration understands perfectly that the cartels and the drug traffickers is a major threat to the US, and it's operating not only in Venezuela but in many countries of the region, in part thanks to the poor and fragile democracies we have here in Latin America. You see the case of Mexico. So as JD Vance uh, said, the best use the U.S. Can give to the military, the best way the U.S. Can use the military, is fighting the drug cartels, because that, although they are based in Mexico, Nicaragua, Venezuela, or Colombia, that is actually impacting seriously, the American way of life, killing people, with the fentanyl and all of this. So I think this administration understands that very well. And of course, once Venezuela is free, the U.S. will have a great ally in Venezuela to advance this war against the narco traffickers.
It does seem opportunistic in that if you were to really have a meaningful restoration of democracy in Venezuela, that would presumably really hurt the influence of Cuba throughout the region. Yeah. So another statement from the Center for Security Policy, which I really enjoyed there or appreciated their insights, was that if there are these mass protests, as they've been for too many years now, mate. I mean, 10 years ago, I was there and there were these huge protests and everyone was optimistic. And now another decade has passed by. But he was saying that if you could somehow get these mass protests to encircle and shut down or suffocate the Sebin, I don't know how you pronounce it, Sebin, Sebin officers,
Irene.
Sabin, yeah. Would you then really be able to strangle this kind of the heartbeat of this regime?
Yeah, I mean, there is some. I'm sure that is something that is on the table, and that may happen. eventually, we saw it last year. There were massive protests, and Maria Corina Machado managed to, make a reborn of the spirit of the Venezuelans. Venezuelans were kind of, very apart from politics during many years, and that changed with Maria Corina Machado. I think that is on the table. However, after last year protests, that succeeded the 28 July 28 elections, many people were on the street protesting. The regime, went very, very repressive, like on a deadly, deadly, deadly way. They killed a lot of people on the streets. People were scared at that moment, and a lot of people stopped, going to the street to protest. However, this wouldn't be the first time. The regime killed a lot of people in 2017, killed a lot of people in 2014. So Venezuelans do know that when they go out to the streets to protest, they are risking their lives. I think that the difference is that Venezuelans are willing to do it if they think risking their lives worth it. They think that risking their life could eventually have an impact and could provoke, something. And I think that with this, what we're seeing in the Caribbean and with all the pressure from the US, that is being built up again. The idea that, maybe eventually, I don't know, in a few days or in a few weeks or in a couple of months, eventually, maybe the Venezuelans will have to go out to the streets to protest, to risk their lives, but because this time it will be definitive, it will be the last time, because this time, risking their life will have an impact and will eventually lead to freedom. So yeah, I think that could happen.
So they will do it with the assumption that there's actually some light at the end of the tunnel, or there's good news on the horizon. And just the claim made in this article was that Sebin is really the kind of heartbeat, the fulcrum point of the regime. If you could somehow just block off the electricity or the communications or whatever with a huge mass of people, that would really put the regime in a more vulnerable position. Now, you've touched upon this briefly, but the other question for people who maybe are getting a bit weary of any kind of engagement is there still some kind of parallel government available to take the reins, right? I know there's been a court in exile. There was Juan Guaido as this kind of like parallel president. Has this all just fallen away? Does this parallel government still exist?
Well, Guaido never won an election, and he never did the impressive way Edmundo Gonzalez and Maria Corina Machado did it, last year. Not only they won in a landslide, 70 to 30, but they managed to prove that victory. So there is a legitimacy that Juan Guaido didn't have. Um, on the other hand, Juan Guaido, yeah, he did build this parallel government, which all the bureaucracy and all this, he started sharing roles, and yeah, roles within, you are going to be the ambassador in this country and you will have a salary and all of that. So that eventually led to corruption and to chaos, and the interests weren't the freedom of Venezuela, but their privilege and all of that. This is not what is happening right now. So you have one person who was elected, which is Edmundo Gonzalez, and that's it. On the other hand, you have, of course, Maria Corina Machado, which is the uh,
Leader of the opposition.
exactly. Of course, Edmundo Gonzalez won, but because of Maria Corina Machado. But you have that, and that's it. The president. And I think that that's all it takes, because when the transition starts, which will start, um, you will not have the question, the conflict of legitimacy. That will not be on the table. You will have many tasks and challenges and all of that, but that is not one of those problems you will have.
So that's one difference. So even if there's not the bureaucracy, there's a stronger sense that Maria Corina Machado and Edmundo Gonzalez have electoral backing or had it, and from a supermajority of the electorate. So it is a strong position to be in. I got to be frank, mate. I wish I could predict the future. I really don't know what is going to happen right now. Why don't you, before I let you go, mate, one final remark on what you think as a journalist, what has been missing from the coverage? What would international observers not understand? What has been sort of failing to make the headlines?
It is starting to make the headlines. It has been tough. It has been a tough travel during all these years to make the U.S. aware of the threat that the regime represents. Wasn't easy. It cost a lot, but it's currently happening. Some people are trying to diminish this and say that, well, yeah, there has been narco trafficking from officials of Venezuela, but this is not a structure, this is not a cartel as the traditional way. It's not that formal, but it is, and it is bigger and more terrifying than we even think. Unfortunately, the last administration not only ignored that, or willingly ignored that, avoided that, but in some way contribute to this dynamic. We know that the previous administration released two nephews of the presidential couple, Nicolas Maduro and Celia, his wife, that were accused. Well, we're not just accused, they were caught trafficking. They were caught trafficking. They were caught in an airplane with drug. They were the nephews of Nicolas Maduro and his wife, and they used the presidential hangar in the main airport of Caracas to live with drug. They were planning to go to the U.S. So fortunately, this is now being addressed by this administration. But people needs to understand that this is serious. When the DEA says that 20 or more percent of the whole drug that the world consumes comes from Venezuela, is serious. This comes from Venezuela. Venezuela has become a major export, cartel of the world. So yeah, thanks God, this is now being addressed. I think people needs to understand this in a more in-depth way. There have been many, reports about this. Many Venezuelans journalists have been reporting about this for the last 10 years. This is not new, but thank God, the administration is finally addressing this.
Yeah. So yeah, your takeaway message, and I agree with it, is that this Solis cartel, it's almost like a super cartel, like greater, more powerful, more dangerous than any cartel in history.
Really, Pablo Escobar, achieving power in Colombia. He wanted to be a politician, but because he wanted to get in, enter Nariño House, the presidential palace. Well, Nicolas Maduro achieved that in Venezuela.
Okay, folks, Orlando is very active on X. It's a place to follow him. We'll have all the links in the show notes, so at impunityobserver.com. If you've not already followed us on X, Orlando, mate, I'm honored to feature your perspective, and I just appreciate the sort of like around the clock coverage you're delivering. So thanks for sharing your time, mate.
No, thank you, Fergus. It's been an honor. Thank you.